You download a budgeting app on a Sunday night, feeling motivated. You set up categories, you input your income, you promise yourself this time is different. By Tuesday of the following week, you've already blown through your dining out budget. By the following Sunday, you've stopped opening the app entirely. Sound familiar? If so, you're in good company. Most people who try to budget quit within a few weeks, and then they do something interesting. They blame themselves. They decide they're just not disciplined enough, that budgeting works for other people but not for them. Here's what almost nobody tells you. It's not you. Most budgets are built in a way that makes them almost guaranteed to fail, regardless of how much willpower you have. Think about the budgeting advice you've probably heard 100 times. Track every expense. Cut out lattes. Follow the 50-30-20 rule. Use this spreadsheet template. All of that advice assumes the problem is information, that if you just see you're spending clearly enough, you'll magically start spending less. But information was never the actual problem. Most people already know roughly that they're spending too much on takeout or subscriptions. Knowing that fact hasn't stopped them before, and a spreadsheet isn't going to change that on its own. The real reason budgets fail has almost nothing to do with math, and almost everything to do with how the budget itself is designed.
My name's Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about money and financial psychology. If you've ever felt like a failure because you couldn't stick to a budget, stick around, because we're going to break down exactly why that happened, and it's probably not the reason you think. Subscribe and hit like if this ends up changing how you approach your money. Here's the first design flaw, and it's the biggest one. Most budgets are built around restriction instead of reality. Someone sits down, looks at their income, and decides what they should be spending in each category based on some generic rule they read online. Groceries, $300. Dining out, $100. Entertainment, $50. These numbers often have nothing to do with how that person actually lives. Maybe they genuinely spend $450 on groceries because they have a family of 4. Maybe their social life genuinely costs more than $100 a month because that's how they maintain relationships that matter to them. When the budget doesn't reflect reality, it doesn't take long before reality wins. The person blows through the grocery budget by the 3rd week of the month, and at that point, something psychologically significant happens. They don't think, okay, I need to adjust this number. They think, I already failed, so what's the point of tracking the rest of the month? One blown category becomes an excuse to abandon the entire system. This connects to something researchers have found again and again when studying both diets and budgets, because the two are more similar than most people realize. Restriction tends to trigger a kind of psychological rebellion. Studies on restrictive dieting consistently show that when people impose strict limits on themselves, they're more likely to eventually binge, precisely because the restriction itself creates pressure that eventually snaps. Budgets work the same way. A budget that's too tight doesn't build discipline, it builds resentment. And resentment is a much weaker foundation for a habit than something that actually feels sustainable. Think about the last time someone told you that you absolutely couldn't have something. Not that you shouldn't, but that you couldn't. There's a good chance that restriction alone made you want it more, even if you hadn't been thinking about it 5 minutes earlier. Budgets built entirely around denial create exactly that dynamic, month after month, until the tension becomes too much to sustain.
Here's the second problem, and it's just as damaging. Most budgets are treated like a moral test instead of a flexible tool. When someone overspends in a category, they don't think of it as useful information. They think of it as a personal failure, evidence that they're bad with money, evidence that maybe they'll never really get their finances together. This all-or-nothing thinking is incredibly common, and it's completely counterproductive. Imagine if a GPS worked the same way. You take one wrong turn, and instead of recalculating your route, it just shuts off completely and says, well, you clearly can't be trusted to drive anywhere, so we're done here. That would be absurd, but that's essentially how most people treat their budget the moment they overspend. One wrong turn, and the whole system shuts down instead of simply recalculating. A good financial system, like a good GPS, should expect wrong turns. It should be built to say recalculating instead of trip canceled. Let's put a number on how common this actually is, because it's not a small minority struggling with this.
Data from budgeting apps has consistently shown that a large share of new users stop actively using the app within the first few months, often somewhere between 1 and 3 months after signing up. That's not a tiny group of uniquely undisciplined people. That's the overwhelming majority of everyone who tries. When something fails that consistently, at that scale, the honest conclusion isn't that millions of people all happen to share the exact same personal flaw. The honest conclusion is that the tool itself is poorly designed for how humans actually behave. If a product failed for the majority of everyone who used it in almost any other industry, we wouldn't blame the users. We'd say the product needs a redesign. Somehow, with budgeting, the blame almost always lands on the person instead of the system. Here's where it gets worse, and this is the part that traps people in a cycle for years. After a budget fails once, most people don't conclude that the budget was flawed. They conclude that budgeting in general doesn't work for them. So the next time they try, they often go even more restrictive, thinking that more discipline will fix what went wrong last time. They cut their dining out budget even further. They add more categories, more rules, more rigid limits. This makes the eventual blow-up even more likely, not less, because an overly restrictive budget is exactly the setup that leads to rebellion and abandonment in the first place. Each failed attempt reinforces the belief that they're simply bad with money, when really they've just been repeating the same flawed design over and over again, expecting a different result.
This is one of the most frustrating cycles in personal finance, because the person doing everything they can to fix the problem is actually making it worse without realizing it, simply because nobody ever told them the design itself was the issue. There's a third issue that compounds all of this, and it's rarely talked about. Most budgets completely ignore irregular expenses: car registration, annual subscriptions, holiday gifts, home or car repairs. Because these costs don't show up every single month, they get left out of the budget entirely. Then when November rolls around and holiday spending hits, or the car needs a $600 repair in March, the entire monthly budget gets blown by something that was completely predictable in the long run, even though it didn't fit neatly into a monthly template. The person feels like they failed again, when really the budget simply wasn't built to account for the full shape of their actual financial life. It's a bit like planning a road trip and only budgeting for gas, then acting shocked when you also need money for tolls, food, and hotel. Those costs weren't a surprise in any real sense. They were just left out of the plan from the very beginning. There's a fourth issue worth mentioning too, because it quietly undermines even well-intentioned budgets. Most people build a budget once and then never look at it again until something goes wrong. Life changes constantly. Rent goes up, a relationship status changes,
A new job shifts your income or your commute costs. A budget built in January, based on your life at that exact moment, has an expiration date built into it, whether anyone acknowledges that or not. Treating it as a permanent, unchanging document guarantees that at some point, the numbers on the page will stop matching the numbers in real life. And when that gap gets wide enough, the whole system starts to feel useless, even though the actual fix might just be a 15-minute update. So, what does an approach that actually works look like? The first shift is building a budget based on your real spending, not an idealized version of it. Before setting any limits, track your actual spending for a full month, without judgment, without trying to change anything yet, just observe. This gives you real numbers instead of guesses pulled from a generic template. If you're consistently spending $450 on groceries, that's your starting number, not $300 because some article said so. You can work on lowering it gradually later, but starting from reality means you're not setting yourself up to fail in week one. This single change alone eliminates most of the shock and shame that usually kicks in by the second week of a new budget. The second shift is building in buffer room on purpose. Instead of assigning every single dollar to a rigid category with zero flexibility, leave a percentage of your budget unassigned, or create a small miscellaneous category that absorbs the inevitable surprises. This single change prevents the domino effect where one unexpected expense topples the entire system. When something unpredictable happens, and something always eventually does, you have room to absorb it instead of treating it as proof the whole plan has collapsed.
Think of this buffer the same way engineers think about a margin of safety in a bridge. Nobody designs a bridge to hold exactly the maximum weight it will ever see and not 1 pound more. There's always room built in, because reality is rarely as tidy as the blueprint. The third shift is planning for irregular expenses instead of ignoring them. Take your annual costs, car insurance, holiday spending, subscriptions, estimated home repairs, add them up and divide by 12. Set aside that amount every single month in a separate fund specifically for these predictable but irregular costs. When November or that unexpected repair bill actually arrives, you're pulling from money you already set aside on purpose, instead of watching your regular monthly budget get demolished by something that was actually foreseeable the entire time. This one shift alone tends to eliminate the single most common reason people abandon a budget mid-year, because the emergency that blows everything up usually wasn't actually an emergency. It was just an expense nobody planned for on paper, even though everyone could have seen it coming.
The fourth shift, and maybe the most important one, is treating your budget like something you adjust, not something you either pass or fail. When you overspend in a category, the right response isn't guilt or abandonment. It's a simple question. Was this number unrealistic to begin with, or was this a genuine one-time slip I can course correct from? Most of the time, it's the first one. Adjust the number and move forward. A budget isn't a test you take once and either pass or fail. It's closer to a living document that should change as your life changes. Because your spending next year in a different apartment, with a different job, with different priorities, is never going to look identical to your spending today. Revisiting your budget every few months isn't a sign that the system failed. It's a sign that the system is actually working the way it's supposed to. There's one more mindset shift worth mentioning because it ties everything together. Stop thinking about budgeting as a punishment for spending money and start thinking about it as a tool for making sure your spending actually lines up with what you care about. A budget that lets you spend freely on the things that genuinely matter to you while cutting back on the things that don't doesn't feel restrictive at all. It feels like clarity. Most people who fail at budgeting were never actually failing at math. They were fighting against a plan that didn't reflect their real priorities, built from someone else's template, calibrated for someone else's life. If you take one thing away from this video, let it be this. Budgeting doesn't fail because you lack discipline. It fails because most people are handed a rigid, unrealistic template and told that any deviation from it means they've personally failed. The people who actually stick with managing their money long-term aren't the ones with superhuman willpower. They're the ones using a system flexible enough to survive contact with real life. Build your budget around who you actually are, not who a generic template assumes you should be, and give yourself permission to adjust it instead of abandoning it the moment reality doesn't match the plan.